Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Today is day 10 of Teaser Season patch 3.27 and the upcoming Keepers of the Flame expansion. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the patch notes. Now, this is not going to be a deep dive through every single line of the patch notes. We are going to be talking about the biggest impact changes, things that have been buffed, things that have been nerfed, things that are going to be important to know going into your period of pre-league theory crafting for this league. I will just give a heads up that this is going to feel like a negative video if you're one of those people that hates anything to do with nerfs. I'm going to be focusing on nerfs because there's a lot of buffs in the patch, but it's not yet clear which of those buffs are really substantial. For instance, if you rewind the clock back to 326, we had a look at the various buffs that were present in that league, and people didn't pick up just how substantial the buffs to the Elementalist were. Likewise, if you go back to when Grinding Gear Games reworked the Trickster, that was a huge suite of buffs that took place to that Ascendancy at that point, and it pushed it to be the best Ascendancy in the game. But that wasn't clear at the time. We worked that out only after a bit of time. So, the buffs that have taken place in this patch, they're harder to assess on their own. I will talk about Winter Orb because it's getting substantial ones. But if it feels like I'm being super negative and only talking about the nerfs, that's because the nerfs are probably the thing that are most important to have in your mind when you're theory crafting. A couple of things in the past where you would have said, oh, I'm playing this type of build, I have to be a Trickster. Now the answer is, I probably don't want to be a Trickster. What other Ascendancies do I pick? And there's going to be a couple of other situations like that. I want to start by taking a look at one of the Ascendancies that got one of the bigger nerfs in this, and that is the Trickster. I think the Trickster is going from being an S tier Ascendancy to being playable Ascendancy. And when I say playable, I think it will actually fall to be one of the lowest played Ascendancies this league, but that will be because people are sick of it. It's not that it's necessarily going to be absolutely terrible. It might not be one of the worst 3 Ascendancies in the game, but I do think it's going to be somewhere around the Gladiator in terms of power. The Gladiator is very functional. It has a cohesive game plan, it does some things really well, but it's also not a superstar at anything. Ultimately, I think the Trickster is going to be in one of those spots where the Forbidden Jewels from it, for the premium nodes that are still left in it, they are going to be better than the class themselves. However, Heartstopper is getting a buff. Heartstopper was often your sort of 5th or 6th best choice on the Ascendancy. It's now going to be really, really good. I know a lot of people don't like conditional defenses, especially ones where you aren't in control of the conditions of them, but the numbers on this are so explosively good that this is just going to be ridiculously powerful when it's up. It's going to be like 5 seconds of God mode, then 5 seconds of normal mode, then 5 seconds of God mode, 5 seconds of normal mode. It is so much better than the defenses that the Assassin gets on its comparable node, the one where you're in the proximity to 2 rare monsters, you take 35% less damage. This is going to be 50% less damage, which is amazing. So let's go through the details of the changes. Heartstopper, buffed from 40% to 50% mitigation while it's active. Soul Drinker, losing the 20% conditional attack and cast speed. That's quite painful. Spellbreaker, losing the 20% chance to suppress. That is really painful early in progression, and also is going to prevent more suppressed damage. However, more on that later, that is still actually a net nerf overall. But one step ahead, the ability to suppress monster action speed is being improved, but not by very much. However, one step ahead no longer provides you with baseline action speed improvement. Instead, it provides you with a floor of 90% of your action speed. It's still reasonably strong, but it's not something that's amazing. One step ahead is definitely going to feel a lot worse than it did before. Ultimately, Trickster will be playable, but will not be overwhelmingly good, and I do think we will see quite a massive shift away from it in the meta. That said, still a very tanky Ascendancy. But we mentioned Spell Suppression, Trickster, Deadeye, and more. Right side builds, Spell Suppression is getting nerfed, but it's still going to be extremely good. Spell Suppression is going from preventing 50% of the damage to 40% of the damage. What's important to note here, this taken on its own would be a substantial survivability nerf to right side builds, and even a slight survivability nerf to left side builds. However, there are some hidden changes in these patch notes, ones that people aren't talking about much. We'll get to those when we talk about Carto Scarab of Risk, but there are a number of very minor changes that actually do add up to a lot, and they're essentially going to increase the tankiness of a lot of builds. That's because a number of small sources of map modifier effect across the entire tree are getting nerfed. More on that in a bit. Now, let's talk about the other Ascendancy that got a high profile nerf, Elementalist. So, Liege of the Primordial. This notable grants only 50% increased effective buffs granted by your golems instead of 100%. Why do I say the Elementalist lives? All this is just nerfing an S+ tier starter Ascendancy that is still pretty good at endgame, down to being S tier on day one, and maybe A or B tier a little bit later in the league. Elementalist is going to be absolutely fantastic for pretty much whatever you throw at it. The reason for this is that the Golem friends, they have a lot of really, really reliable power. You get damage. You get damage over time multiplier. You get cast speed. You get mana regen. You get accuracy. You get crit. You get chaos resist. And I even forgot to mention on the screen that you also get global defenses. All of these things come together in the one package. You also get a lot of them. It's not like you're getting 3% here, 4% there. This is not a 1,000 ribbons situation where there's a lot of little things and they don't really add up to very much. Instead, you're just getting a lot of power here. That single 2-pointer node on the Elementalist is enough power to get you right into endgame. Everything that you need to get a build working is present here. Now, I want to also mention one of the new things that's coming in 3.27 because it's going to apply a lot when we're talking about the Elementalist. And this is those new boss Ascendancies. Now, if you're not aware of these, when you kill certain bosses, I consider these to be an extension of any of the classic Ascendancies. It's just more options that you can pick. Points that you invest in these boss-specific Ascendancies do come out of your normal Ascendancy pool of points. So this is the King in the Mist one, and ultimately I'm not very impressed with the King in the Mist one, but I'm expecting that there'll be some of these that are quite juicy. What this means when you talk about the Elementalist is the Elementalist has a lot of its power concentrated in a small number of nodes. So you have Liege of the Primordial is the single, absolutely S+ tier node in the Ascendancy. Then after that, you've got a lot of flex slots. Mastermind of Discord is really, really good. You want to get Mastermind of Discord in on almost every Elementalist build. You probably want one of the Shaper nodes. Then you want Bastion of Elements, but you don't have to have it. You want Convergence, but you don't have to have it. You might want a second Shaper node, but you don't have to have it. And if there are better choices in one of the boss-tied Ascendancies, then maybe that is what you want to end up doing. I think the Elementalist has the most power concentrated into 2 points of any one Ascendancy, and the most power concentrated into 4 points of any one Ascendancy as well. So what this means is the Elementalist is a really good flexible option while we don't know what all of these boss Ascendancies are. But also, if it does turn out that all of those boss Ascendancies are bad, well, you have a solid fourth choice in the Elementalist as well. It's not like you're in a situation where you've gone, oh, I've got 3 cohesive nodes, they make for a great whole, but I don't have anything else to spend points on. No, with the Elementalist, you've got a lot of flexibility there. So, Elementalist, hyping it up because I still think it's looking really, really good, despite the fact that it's got this nerf here. Okay, so I said we'd talk about Cartography, Scarab of Risk, and Map Modifier Effect. Firstly, you can no longer stack 5 Carto Scarabs of Risk. You can only play one of them on a given map. Now, this is not going to affect the main strategies that Cartography, Scarab of Risk was used for, or if it does, it's only going to be a modest nerf to them. But the other thing that's noticeable is that Map Modifier Effect has been replaced by other unrelated good stats in a lot of places. So for instance, one of the clusters that is a Map Mod Effect cluster, it is giving more magic monsters as a replacement stat for the small node that lead up to it that granted increased Map Modifier Effect. So that's going to be something that is a nerf to the amount of Map Mod Effect you can get. What does nerfing Map Modifier Effect do? Well, it makes characters more durable. Because big physical hits don't kill characters, Map Modifier Effect does. If you ever take a 15,000 point physical hit in a map, it's because that was intended as a 7,000 point hit, but you scaled so much Map Modifier Effect and various things that multiply together that it wound up being 15,000. So in many ways, I think of this as part of the same package as the changes that are taking place to Suppression. One Risk Scarab is still very strong in a lot of places if you're playing one of the builds that can manage to play a Risk Scarab, but if you're playing a build that can't manage a Risk Scarab, the fact that the Risk Scarab stackers aren't able to go with 2 or 3 of them on a strategy means that you're not pushed to compete with that. They're capped at 1, you're not all that far behind with 0. Next we have Rogue Exiles. This is something that's sort of flown under the radar a bit while people have been looking at the patch notes. Most of the Rogue Exile farms are dead now. There is a line in there that says that Rogue Exile quantity is being reduced, except for the additional burst that they have of 1 item for each inventory slot. So I think most of the Rogue Exile farms are being outright deleted, as is the Blight Scarab of Blooming farm, I don't think that these survive in their present forms. And let's round out the nerf discussion, shall we, by talking about the S-tier skills from day one in 3.26. There's a few of these that are looking pretty bad at the moment, but some of them are easily replaced. We already said that the Elementalist package, which wasn't recognized as S-tier on day one in 3.26, but definitely did become that once people got a bit more familiar with the Ascendancy, the Elementalist package is still mostly intact. Blink Arrow Mirror Arrow builds, I think these are dead. They're taking a duration nerf, and they're also taking damage nerfs to both of their gems. I think this is pretty crushing. I could be wrong on this. Probably people will still manage to make it work, but I don't think it's looking anything like it used to. Volcanic Fissure of Snaking. The Slams archetype is still fine. I don't know how bad the Volcanic Fissure of Snaking nerf is. The way that it's worded, it sounds like it's no longer going to be as reliable at multiple hitting bosses. So it's going to hit them once, then it's going to wander off somewhere else. That's the way that I read it. But ultimately, Volcanic Fissure of Snaking was far from the only good slam skill. So, Earth Shatter. Earth Shatter is as good as it was in 3.26. People didn't play Earth Shatter in 3.26 because it was outshone by a very similar skill, but now that it's no longer outshone, well, it's got a chance to shine. Bouncy Poisonous Concoction and Explosive Concoction, I think these two are probably both dead, although I could be wrong on that. So that's a lot of nerfs out of the way. Let's start talking about things that got buffed as well now. So let's start with Heist. Heist has got a bunch of small changes that seem like they're coming together to be a bit more of a cohesive whole. Heist has had this identity that it's just ignore everything except the curio at the end of the blueprint. I think they're starting to push away from that a bit. One of the key things here that I think is going to be a substantial improvement, Heist, which previously could spawn breach reward rooms, can now spawn gold reward rooms instead. These will drop a sizable amount of gold. Now, gold is something that is very important at endgame. If the numbers on this are high, then Heist is going to be really, really good. And obviously it's thematically appropriate. You know, you're going heisting. Of course, you're going to expect to get gold in there. Pre-existing breach reward rooms, this only really applies in standard. They're going to be converted into gold rooms now as well. The other thing that'll matter if you're a high star is that there is a bug fix taking place to the Awakener's Orb. Why does this matter for anything other than Cirrus? Well, it's because Simplex Amulet Demand, and this actually is mostly Simplex, not Focused Amulet, Simplex Amulet Demand is probably going to be up as a consequence. The people who have ridiculous amounts of currency to throw at top-end crafts, they're likely to want more Simplex Amulet bases, and then they'll resell their failed attempts at crafts later. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for. Side note, Hinakora's locks are going to go up as a result of this, and Hinakora's locks are already crazy expensive. Okay, let's go for something that's got a big buff, and this is Winter Orb. So the old behavior of Winter Orb, once per 1,600 milliseconds when you're not channeling, and once per 711 milliseconds while you are channeling, it fires off its projectiles. That's the base, and that can be improved. Now, this is going to be 1,200 instead of 1,600, and 667 milliseconds instead of 711. So this is unconditionally a buff. It's a bigger buff while you are not channeling, and it is a smaller buff while you're channeling, but it is just a big buff on Winter Orb. Now you may notice that there is a bit of a snowstorm / blizzard elementalist backdrop going on here. Let's just say that's completely coincidental. It's not like the elementalists are providing you with a whole bunch of useful stats for a Winter Orb build, like increased cast speed, increased unconditional damage, increased chaos resistance, increases to global defenses, all sorts of good stuff. Elementalist has got it all, and that's exactly what you're probably going to want if you're playing a Winter Orb build. Or alternately, on a much higher budget, you could potentially grab the Forbidden Jewels in order to become a pseudo-elementalist when you're actually an occultist at heart. And that's probably going to be the end game for those builds. Alright, now we have one of my favourite single lines in the patch notes. Hardcore is getting something from POE 2. In Path of Exile 2, if you're playing in Hardcore League and your character dies, it remains playable in Softcore League. In Path of Exile 1, it goes to Permanent Standard instead. So, what's changing is that your Hardcore Keepers characters are then going to be available to play in Softcore Keepers, rather than Permanent Standard. Now, there's a couple of key things here. Firstly, if you're a Hardcore player, this means that you will not have Standard players really distorting your economy. You will instead potentially get League Softcore players doing this, and some things like Hinakora's locks might end up being more expensive in Hardcore as a result. But you're not going to get people buying up all of the exclusive League mechanic related unique items and then transferring them via Grim Reaper Express over to Standard League. I think this will increase the stability of the economy for hardcore players, although there will be a couple of specific scenarios where this gets worse, like the Hinakora's Lock example. But the key thing that I think is the improvement here is that if you play in the other main hard mode, solo self-found, if you discover a while into the league, I am just not liking playing the game with this self-imposed additional difficulty, then you've got the ability to just migrate your character and your progress into the normal version of the league and play there instead. However, if you discover that you don't like hardcore halfway through a league, you're then faced with a choice. Either keep playing in hardcore and have less fun than you might in softcore, or alternately, have to start from absolutely nothing. With this change, you can essentially migrate. I don't believe you can migrate your Atlas progress, but you can migrate your character power, and you can migrate specific items if you want to as well. So it gives you that flexibility to just try out the hard mode, decide it's not for you, and still be able to just get on with playing the game normally. So all in all, I think this is a big improvement to the way things have worked in the past in Path of Exile 1, and this is one of those things that PoE 2 is experimenting with first, and then we get it over in PoE 1 as well. Okay, so now we're going to jump to some more mechanical changes, and here we're going to talk about changes to critical strike numbers on weapons. Now, I'm not going to go through everything in this list here, but the core identity here is that Grinding Gear games want daggers to have an identity, and that identity is this is the weapon that is the most likely to land a critical strike. And essentially this ends up as a nerf to wands and a buff to daggers overall, but there's a number of other little changes going on behind the scenes. It's not something that's a massive suite of changes, but generally speaking, most wands have taken a small decrease to their base critical strike chance, so they end up being lower than daggers, and most daggers have got a big buff. At the same time though, if you're thinking of League starting a wand, this is actually going to be much better now because of another change. There are 3 new wand-based modifiers, the Blasting Wand, Kinetic Wand, and the Semantic Wand. These will all share the same implicit modifier, cannot roll caster mods. These are going to make starting a wand attack character much more reasonable than it's been in the past. Getting an attack wand to roll that is anything other than derisory tier has been really, really difficult in the past. So even with low standards, it was rough, but now it's going to be quite a bit better. Now I want to finish with one of the most interesting lines in the entire patch notes, because sometimes you can see a line and go, hey, that's a buff, out of context. But then when you know about it in context, it ends up looking much more like a nerf. Enter Coiling Whisper. This ring is getting no changes. Everyone expected this ring to get a crushing nerf after how over the top it was in patch 3.26. However, while Coiling Whisper is not technically nerfed, one of the things that was empowering it is. Except it's actually a buff that's taking place. So Hextouch support is being changed in such a way that instead of providing reduced duration to the curses, it's going to provide less duration. Now, if you're not investing in the duration of your curses, or you're just taking incidental investment into curse duration because there's a couple of nodes on the tree that do that, then this is going to be a buff for most purposes. However, if your entire motivation in using Hextouch support was that you wanted to decrease the duration of a curse as much as possible, if you were investing in reduced duration on the tree, then this is going to not end up being a buff for you. It's going to be exactly the opposite. Now, there are still ways to make Coiling Whisper work, and what I think is going to be best is a Lightning Warp that is linked to Hextouch. Now, Lightning Warp becomes a better skill when you do reduce duration on it, and at the same time, it's delivering hexes for you. You're able to get in, tap a boss with a short duration hex that's not crushingly short, and then after that, you can just wait out the hex and then get that tremendous boost of increased souls, and then you can go and Lightning Warp back into the boss again and do it again. Essentially, Coiling Whisper is going to be something that still works, but it is not going to work in automated ways, the way that it did in patch 3.26, and that's all due to the fact that Grinding Gear games have gone out of their way to buff Hextouch support. Anyways, that's what we've got for the moment. Said I wanted to go through the highest profile things. There are a lot of buffs as well. We've been talking about nerfs, but there are definitely a lot of buffs in these patch notes too. That said, the things that are probably going to have the biggest impact on your plans early on are going to be the nerfs. So that's the reason I wanted to mostly focus on them here. May your Varlorbs and your patch note nerfs have interesting results.